The United States is leading a new coup attempt in Venezuela and is trying to impose a new government on the country. Now, this might sound like deja vu because this is exactly what Washington did 5 years ago. In 2019, the Donald Trump administration recognized a little-known right-wing opposition politician named Juan Guaidó as the supposed president of Venezuela, despite the fact that he had never participated in a presidential election. Well, here we are in 2024, and now the Biden administration announced that it recognized another right-wing opposition politician named Edmundo González as the supposed president of Venezuela. That is to say, the US is launching a coup attempt, and now the US is pressuring other countries around the world to join it in recognizing a new president of Venezuela. To justify this, the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken published a statement, and he presented no evidence that the election was supposedly stolen by the actual president, Nicolás Maduro. Instead, he only cited sources that are funded by the US government, as I will show today. He cited sources funded by the US State Department. He cited right-wing opposition groups in Venezuela, and he cited exit polling done by biased groups in Venezuela and by a US firm that works for the US government and is linked to the CIA. Today, I'll be showing in detail how the US government's claims are not backed up by evidence. And also, it is so ironic that Antony Blinken, the US Secretary of State, is helping to lead this coup attempt right now, given that the Biden administration is currently backing numerous dictatorships. For instance, in Pakistan, the elected Prime Minister Imran Khan was overthrown in a US-backed coup in 2022, and he was imprisoned on bogus charges. And the US helped Pakistan's coup regime, that's unofficially led by the military, steal the recent election. And furthermore, the US is backing an unelected coup regime right now in Peru after the democratically elected left-wing president, Pedro Castillo, was overthrown and imprisoned without charges. And the current right-wing president of Peru, who's very corrupt, Dina Boluarte, was never elected, and yet Antony Blinken recognizes her, while he claims without any evidence that there was fraud in Venezuela and refuses to recognize the Venezuelan president, Maduro. And of course, as Antony Blinken says this and backs a coup attempt, he's also supporting the horrific crimes against humanity that Israel is carrying out in Gaza with unflinching support from the Biden administration, billions of dollars of weapons. Antony Blinken is overseeing all of that. So he clearly does not care in any way about human rights. He is overseeing the most monstrous violations of human rights imaginable right now being carried out against the Palestinian people. He does not care. I explained in a recent video, which I will link to in the description below, why the US government has spent so many years constantly backing coups to try to overthrow Venezuela's democratically elected government. The brief summary is that Venezuela has the world's largest oil reserves. It also has many other natural resources that US corporations want to get their hands on. Furthermore, Venezuela for 20 years now has been governed by a revolutionary project known as the Bolivarian Revolution that is committed to challenging capitalism and imperialism and US neocolonialism. Venezuela has built regional institutions to try to integrate Latin America and challenge the dictatorship of the US dollar. Venezuela has also formed a close partnership with China and Russia and Iran, and has tried to build a multipolar world, challenging US hegemony. So for 2 decades now, the US has backed numerous coup attempts in Venezuela. In April of 2002, there was a briefly successful military coup that overthrew Venezuela's democratically elected leftist president, Hugo Chavez, for 2 days. The mainstream British newspaper The Guardian reported at the time that the George W. Bush administration played a leading role in backing this coup. And in fact, just a few weeks before the US-backed coup, the Venezuelan coup leader, the rich businessman Pedro Carmona, he met with top US government officials. And just a few months before the coup, the Venezuelan army's chief of staff, a top general, visited the Pentagon to meet with top US military officials. And then he helped to lead the coup against Venezuela's elected president. And during this latest coup attempt in 2024, the corporate media coverage of Venezuela has been so outrageous and ridiculous and full of fake news. In fact, a right-wing media outlet in Spain called Intereconomía brought on as a guest the former coup leader, Pedro Carmona, who overthrew Venezuela's elected president in a military coup for 2 days, backed by the US. The Spanish media outlet invited him on TV to accuse President Maduro of, quote, mega electoral fraud with no evidence. So quite literally, the media in the West is bringing on coup leaders to accuse Venezuela's elected president of fraud. I mean, it is absolutely incredible how blatant this US-backed coup attempt is. During the time of this coup in 2002, the US immediately recognized the unelected coup regime led by a right-wing oligarch. That's why it's laughable today seeing the US government claim that there was supposedly electoral fraud in Venezuela, citing as supposed evidence US government-funded organizations. However, Washington faces a very big obstacle, which is the fact that many governments in Latin America are not going along with this US-backed coup attempt. In fact, on the 31st of July, there was a vote in the Organization of American States, the OAS, which is basically a US-controlled organization that has backed many coups across Latin America. And in this vote, many countries in the region did not go along with the US, including the biggest countries in Latin America, Brazil and Mexico, including Venezuela's neighbor, Colombia, including Bolivia and Honduras and Belize, and numerous countries in the Caribbean. They did not vote for this resolution that was introduced by the far-right governments in the region, with the support in particular of Argentina's far-right US-backed leader, Javier Milei, who is closely collaborating with the CIA and Israel. And of course, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba are not members of the OAS. They left the organization, criticizing it for backing coups and acting as what they refer to as the US Ministry of the Colonies, as an arm of US colonialism. And therefore, so many countries in Latin America and the Caribbean did not support this resolution, and therefore it did not pass in the OAS. This was a failure for the US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela. Now, I mentioned that Venezuela is not even a member of the OAS. It officially applied to leave in 2017, and that process is 2 years long. So as of 2019, Venezuela is not a member. However, 2019 is also when the Trump administration recognized unelected puppet Juan Guaidó as the supposed president, and the OAS, which is basically controlled by the US, recognized him as the so-called president of Venezuela. So it's deeply ironic that the OAS is now trying to condemn Venezuela because they actually don't even officially recognize the real president, Maduro. But very few people in Latin America are surprised by the role of the OAS in trying to rubber stamp this coup, given that in 2019, the OAS backed a far-right coup that overthrew Bolivia's democratically elected left-wing president, Evo Morales. So the OAS has been used so many times by the US to back coups. And in fact, the US government has basically admitted that the OAS is a political arm. The US State Department in 2018 published a congressional budget justification that requested more money to fund the OAS because the OAS is based in Washington and largely funded by the US government. And this US State Department document described the OAS as an organization that, quote, promotes US political and economic interests in the Western Hemisphere by countering the influence of anti-US countries such as Venezuela. So of course, a US government-funded organization that serves US interests and counters Venezuela is going to back another US coup attempt in Venezuela. It's not a surprise. In fact, Mexico's president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, known as AMLO, he actually openly criticized the OAS and he condemned it for constantly interfering and intervening in the internal affairs of other countries. The Mexican president said at a press conference, quote, "Why does the OAS have to get involved? That is interference. That is why the OAS has no credibility." And then he said, quote, "On what basis is the OAS claiming that the other candidate won? Where is the proof?" And then he said, quote, "The OAS is not a democratic nor an autonomous organization. It does not represent the countries of America." And of course, in Latin America, when people say America, they're not referring to the US. They say America is the entire region of America. The US is Estados Unidos. He's saying that the OAS does not represent the countries of Latin America. Instead, of course, the implication is he's saying that the OAS only represents the United States, where it's based. And in fact, Mexico's incoming president-elect, Claudia Sheinbaum, who won the elections this year, and she'll become president of Mexico in December, she also condemned the OAS for interference. She said the OAS, quote, has had a role more of interventionism than coordinating between countries in the region. And she said, quote, "The most important thing is the self-determination of the people of Venezuela." So here you can see another example of numerous politicians in Mexico, the current president and the upcoming president-elect, saying the OAS does not represent us. This is a tool of interventionism in our region. However, it's not just many countries in Latin America that are opposing the US-backed coup attempt in Venezuela. This, like so many things in the world today, has also become a larger geopolitical conflict, and China and Russia and Iran have backed Venezuelan President Maduro. Many other countries in the global south, in Africa and Asia, have backed President Maduro. So essentially, it's the US and a small handful of right-wing allies in Latin America that are backing this coup attempt. And what's especially hilarious is that Peru's unelected right-wing coup regime was the first government to recognize Venezuela's right-wing opposition figure, Edmundo González, as the supposed president-elect of Venezuela. Again, I need to emphasize, Peru right now is governed by an unelected coup regime that is extremely corrupt, that killed dozens of pro-democracy protesters after a coup overthrew the elected left-wing president Pedro Castillo, who was imprisoned without trial. This dictatorship was the first country that recognized Venezuela's right-wing figure, Edmundo González, as so-called president. I mean, the jokes write themselves. This has nothing whatsoever to do with democracy. This is about oligarchy. This is an attempt by the US empire and its right-wing puppets in Latin America that are led by big corporations and rich oligarchs. They are trying to reimpose control on Venezuela. And this is also why the billionaire oligarch Elon Musk is playing a key role in backing this coup attempt in Venezuela as well. I discussed that in a recent video showing how Elon Musk is collaborating with some of the far-right forces in Latin America, especially Argentina's far-right president Javier Milei, who wants to give his country's natural resources over to Elon Musk and other oligarchs. Now, while this is all going on, a US government official actually indirectly threatened to invade Venezuela. That was the implication of a tweet Mark Feuerstein is a longtime regime change operative who works with USAID, which is a CIA cutout that has been involved, for instance, in arming the Contras, the far-right extremist paramilitary group in Nicaragua in the 1980s, backed by the CIA. They claim that they talk about humanitarianism and aid. No, they're an arm of the CIA. And on Twitter, Mark Feuerstein, he made a parallel between the US invasion of Panama in 1989 that overthrew Panama's leader, Noriega. In 1989, the US military invaded Panama and killed hundreds of civilians and overthrew the Panamanian government, which was partially aimed at trying to reimpose US control over the Panama Canal. And now what we see is that this US government official is drawing a parallel to Venezuela. And he said, quote, "By permitting a fair vote count, Maduro can avoid the risk of Noriega's fate." So he's saying very clearly that the US has the possibility of invading Venezuela and overthrowing the Venezuelan President Maduro like it did to Panama. This is very extreme. And by the way, while we're on the subject of this US government regime change operative, Mark Feuerstein, he also worked with a very shady DC-based firm called CLS Strategies, which was exposed in 2020 as being paid millions of dollars to spread fake news for the right-wing Venezuelan opposition, for the right-wing coup regime that was backed by the US government in Bolivia, and also for the right-wing opposition in Mexico. And again, this operation was being partially overseen by this USAID operative, Mark Feuerstein, who is now once again threatening Venezuela. So if you see the constant flood of fake news and disinformation on social media that is claiming all these outrageous things about Venezuela, and they're showing videos from other countries and from years ago and claiming that it's Venezuela today, keep in mind that we have evidence in the past of these US government-linked organizations being paid millions of dollars by right-wing forces in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Mexico to spread fake news on their behalf. And furthermore, the notorious US mercenary Erik Prince is also threatening Venezuela's President Maduro. Erik Prince is a far-right political operative who was previously the leader of the mercenary firm Blackwater that was notorious for killing large numbers of civilians in Iraq. And in fact, employees of Blackwater were imprisoned. They were found guilty and imprisoned. But what happened? Donald Trump pardoned them, despite the fact that they killed large numbers of Iraqi civilians. And one of the reasons that he did this is because Trump is a close political ally of Erik Prince. And on Twitter, Prince pointed to a bounty that was sent out by the Trump administration that offered $15 million for anyone who would try to arrest the Venezuelan president Maduro. And Erik Prince called for the current US government, the Biden administration, to increase these bounties to $100 million. So, I mean, these extremists are like mafia leaders. They are calling for essentially the head of a foreign leader, of the president of a foreign government. This is what the US government is actually like on the international stage. It is a mafioso. But I have to say, we can't be too surprised because, like I said, Erik Prince is a far-right political operative, and he openly called for the United States to colonize Latin America and Africa. He is an extremist colonialist mercenary who wants the US empire to colonize the world. And that's why he wants to overthrow Venezuela's President Maduro. This is all part of a US neo-colonialist scheme to reimpose control on Latin America. Now, I want to go back to this statement that was made by US Secretary of State Antony Blinken on the 1st of August, in which he announced that the US government recognizes Edmundo González as the supposed president of Venezuela. This is the opposition figure. Now, in this statement, Blinken only cited sources that are funded by the US government. As the first example, Blinken cited what he described as the Independent Carter Center. The Carter Center is a political organization that was founded by the former US President Jimmy Carter, and it is not independent. It is directly funded by the US State Department, where Antony Blinken is the leader. He's the Secretary of State. This is not hidden. If you go to the Carter Center's website, they disclose their so-called funding partners, the groups that fund them. They include the United States Department of State and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID, which is a CIA cutout that was used to arm the Contras in Nicaragua in the 1980s by the CIA. This organization, the Carter Center, is also funded by the Australian government, the Canadian government, the Belgian government. It is funded by Palantir, which is a CIA and a Pentagon contractor that does mass surveillance. It is funded by the European Union. It is funded by the British Foreign Office. It is funded by another US government organization, Freedom House, which is a neoconservative regime change organization. It's funded by the government of Germany. It's funded by the CIA-linked foundations, the Gates Foundation and Open Society. It's funded by the US-dominated World Bank. It's funded by Meta, the major US corporation. And the most hilarious irony of all is that the Carter Center claims to be a leading voice on democracy and election monitoring. But you know who funds it? Gulf monarchies like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates. They fund this organization that talks about democracy. So you have to ask, what is the goal of an organization like this? Why would the US government fund it? Why would big US corporations that are linked to the CIA fund it? Why would Saudi Arabia fund an organization that is supposedly dedicated to democracy and election monitoring? Saudi Arabia is a hereditary absolute monarchy. The UAE is a monarchy. Qatar is a monarchy. Why would they fund this? Because this is a political organization that is serving their geopolitical interests. They're investing in this organization. They're not just donations. They are political investments, just like big corporations donate to US political campaigns as a form of investment, because they know that if they fund a politician, when the politician is elected, that politician will have to serve their interests. And this is why it's not surprising that ultimately the Carter Center, which is funded by the US government, did not recognize the electoral victory of Venezuelan President Maduro. However, if you read their statement, what becomes clear is that they have no evidence of fraud. Instead, what they simply say is they cannot verify or corroborate the results of the election declared by Venezuela's National Electoral Council. So what this really is it's a question of he said, she said. There is no evidence of fraud. So what it comes down to is, do you believe the US government and the opposition that it funds and the organizations that it funds, those are the ones claiming fraud? Or do you believe the Venezuelan government? You have to pick one, and the US government is obviously picking the organizations that it funds that are carrying out a coup attempt that it is backing. So now let's go back to this statement from Antony Blinken from the US State Department. The other source that Blinken cites is the so-called democratic opposition in Venezuela, which is literally funded by the US government. And he said that the opposition in Venezuela has published some of the tally sheets received from polling stations. But this is information that is manipulated and in the hands of the Venezuelan opposition, which is declaring itself the victor of the election and trying to overthrow the president. So they have every incentive to tamper with the results, to manipulate what is being published. We have no way to verify that what they are publishing is real. It's simply the US government saying, we recognize the opposition that we fund and the tally sheets that they are publishing on their websites that we have no way of verifying, and we have no idea if they're actually real. So instead, the final so-called source that Antony Blinken cited is he said that independent observers have corroborated these facts, including he mentioned election day exit polls, but he doesn't actually name who those are. He just says independent observers. But some of the exit polls that were done by polling firms in Venezuela showed results that were very similar to the final results. For instance, the major polling firm Intervencionism in Venezuela, they published an exit poll that estimated that Maduro would win with 54.6% of the vote, and that the US-backed opposition candidate, Edmundo González, would win with 42.8% of the vote. That was very similar to the final results. So why is the US government ignoring this exit poll? Because in reality, Antony Blinken, in his statement, he's referencing an exit poll that was done by a New Jersey-based US firm that works closely with US government propaganda outlets that were founded by the CIA. So Antony Blinken is citing a US government-backed organization that did an exit poll that claimed that the opposition would win in order to claim as evidence that the opposition won. So once again, we see this complete circular logic. So you're forced to believe what the US government claims in order to back these claims of electoral fraud. And I'm going to briefly go through an investigation that I published over at geopoliticaleconomy.com. I will link to it in the description below. In this article, I showed how the US political operative who oversaw this exit poll in Venezuela is a man named Rob Farbman, whose specialty is operations in the Middle East and North Africa. And he previously worked in places like Iraq and Ukraine and Georgia, countries where the US has invaded or targeted the country for regime change, like the 2014 US-backed coup in Ukraine, or today the US is targeting Georgia. The US invaded Iraq. So this guy is extremely suspicious. He's very shady. And who are his top clients? He's worked with British state propaganda, the BBC, and US state propaganda, Voice of America, the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. What are these organizations? They are US government propaganda organizations that are overseen by the US government propaganda agency, which is known as the US Agency for Global Media. And these propaganda organs were literally founded by the CIA. This was admitted in a 1977 article published by the New York Times, and it described these media outlets as part of a, quote, worldwide propaganda network built by the CIA, including Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. And originally, Radio Free Europe was founded as, quote, Radio Liberation from Bolshevism. That was the name. Radio Liberation from Bolshevism. This was a CIA propaganda organ. They actually don't hide this very well. If you go to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's website, they admit that they were originally founded by the CIA. So we're supposed to believe that a US polling firm that works with US government propaganda outlets founded by the CIA and that was previously active in Ukraine, Iraq, and Georgia, we're supposed to believe that the polling that it does in Venezuela on behalf of the Venezuelan opposition, who they were clearly collaborating with, we're supposed to believe that their poll is legitimate. These are the only sources that the US State Department cited. Again, the US State Department funded Carter Center, the right-wing opposition in Venezuela, which is also funded by the US government, people like the extremist María Corina Machado, who has led numerous organizations like, for instance, Sumate, which was funded by the US government, as I'm going to show in another report. And WikiLeaks cables show that she has collaborated over many years with the US Embassy, with the US government. So the US State Department is citing people it funds who are claiming they won the election. And then the only other source they cite is so-called exit polls, but they ignore the exit polls that show that Maduro was going to win. And instead, they're obviously referencing exit polls done by a US government-backed organization linked to the CIA. So here we can see that this is another blatant US-backed coup attempt. But the difference between this US-backed coup attempt now in 2024 and the US-backed coup attempt where Trump recognized Juan Guaidó in 2019, the difference now is that Latin America is much more divided. Because in 2019, many of the governments in Latin America had right-wing political leaders, whereas now in Latin America, there are still many left-wing governments, and the left-wing governments are either neutral or are openly supporting Venezuela, whereas the right-wing governments in places like Argentina, led by far-right extremist Javier Milei, or in Ecuador, which is led by a literal US citizen, he's the president, a US citizen, and then the right-wing unelected coup regime in Peru, and then a small handful of small right-wing governments. They're the only governments in the region that are supporting this US-led coup attempt. Brazil, Colombia, Bolivia, Mexico, Honduras, Belize, numerous countries in the Caribbean, they are not backing this US coup attempt. And of course, Nicaragua and Cuba have already recognized President Maduro. So the US is more diplomatically isolated than it wants you to think. And in reality, of course, the corporate media is going to continue spreading ridiculous disinformation about Venezuela. Billionaire oligarchs like Elon Musk are going to spread fake news about Venezuela. But the reality is that the US does not have a lot of foreign diplomatic support for this coup attempt. There will probably be some governments in Europe that join along with this coup, but most countries in the global south are not joining along. China and Russia and Iran are not joining along. They've already recognized Venezuela. And the US has already imposed a brutal economic blockade on Venezuela. So what are they going to do? Impose more sanctions? Another blockade? Venezuela is already one of the most heavily sanctioned countries on earth. Now, there is a small possibility that the US government tries to invade Venezuela to overthrow President Maduro. This was threatened by the USAID operative Mark Fierstein, who I talked about earlier, who's the longtime US government regime change operative at the CIA cutout USAID. He drew a parallel to the US invasion of Panama in 1989, where the US invaded the country and overthrew the president and killed hundreds of civilians. There's a possibility that the US could try to do this in Venezuela, but honestly, I don't think that's likely, especially considering that Russia has expressed support for Venezuela and would not tolerate the US invading Venezuela, its ally. So we're no longer in 1989, or we're no longer in this unipolar world in which the US is a global dictatorship that tries to overthrow any foreign government, invade foreign governments, and impose leaders on foreign governments. We're no longer in that era. We're in a multipolar world. The US can try to back another coup, but the world is not going to go along. The majority of the world is not going to go along with this US coup attempt. Maybe a few puppet regimes in Latin America and its obedient proxies in Europe, they'll go along with the US, but the world is not going to go along with this coup attempt, which again is simply the latest in a long, long line of coup attempts. If you want to know more information about those previous US-backed coup attempts in Venezuela and why the US has been so obsessed with trying to overthrow Venezuela's government, I will link in the description below the other recent videos that I did explaining that. But I'm going to conclude here. I'm Ben Norton. This is Geopolitical Economy Report. I want to thank everyone for joining me today. I will be back soon with lots more coverage of Venezuela and many other issues. I will see you all next time.